I still remember the night like it happened yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years. It was 2003, and I was 27 years old, living in Arizona. I wasn't from there originally. I grew up in Ohio, but I had taken a job that moved me out west. The desert was nothing like the quiet, wet woods of home. The air was dry, the nights dropped cold, and the emptiness could feel endless. That fall, I decided to get away for a weekend, so I rented a small cabin near the Navajo reservation, a few miles outside of Kayenta. The cabin wasn't much, just a one-story wood structure, no insulation, no electricity, no running water, but it was isolated, which was exactly what I thought I wanted. I drove there on a Friday afternoon. The sun was still high, the horizon baked in orange and red as the rock formations cut against the sky. The directions I'd gotten weren't clear, just mile markers and vague descriptions. So I kept circling dusty paths until I finally spotted the small wooden structure, sitting by itself like it had been forgotten. A single dirt trail led up to it, but it was surrounded by flat land that stretched out to mesas and scrub brush. The place felt wrong the second I got out of the car. Not haunted wrong, but like I didn't belong there. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air was pressing down on me. No wind, no insects, nothing. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was bare. Just a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove that looked older than I was. Dust coated everything. The only decoration was a set of antlers mounted above the doorway, sun-bleached and cracked. I told myself it was perfect. No negurs, no phones, no noise. Just me and the desert. By evening, I was sitting on the small porch with a can of beans and a lantern. The sun sank low, casting long shadows across the land. As soon as the light started fading, the silence broke. Coyotes howled somewhere in the distance, their cries sharp and shrill. I'd heard coyotes before, but these sounded different, drawn out like someone was forcing the sound out of their throat. It raised the hair on my arms. I told myself it was just echo, the way sound carried across the desert. I went inside and locked the door, though the lock was just a flimsy bolt that wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get in. I unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot and tried to sleep, but the noise outside got worse. The coyotes moved closer. I could tell by how the cries sharpened, breaking into shorter yips and growls. Then I heard something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog nosing around the cabin. But the steps were too heavy. They circled slowly, crunching over dirt and gravel. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my neck. The footsteps stopped right outside the window near the cot. I didn't move. The lantern was out, but the moonlight came through the cracks in the shutters. I could see a shadow shifting outside, like someone was standing there, waiting. Then I heard it, my own name. It came low, dragged out, almost whispered. The voice was wrong, broken somehow, like someone had never spoken before and was trying to copy the sound. It made my stomach twist. I knew no one knew I was there. Not a single person except the man I'd rented the cabin from. I stayed frozen, not daring to breathe. Minutes passed. The shadow shifted again, and the steps moved away from the window, slow and deliberate. I heard the gravel crunch around the cabin, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning finally came, the land looked normal again. Bright sun, clear sky, no tracks I could see. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Lack of sleep, too much isolation. Still, I didn't feel safe. I made coffee on a small camping stove I'd brought and debated leaving, but I told myself it would be a waste to cut the trip short. All day, I stayed close to the cabin, wandering only a little ways out. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything strange. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that the night had played tricks on me. But as soon as it got dark again, the noises started. Not the distant coyote calls this time, closer. And not just one or two. It sounded like a group circling out in the brush. Their cries rose and fell, some sharp, some low, some almost human. I sat at the table inside the cabin, clutching my flashlight like a weapon. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, dragging. They came right up to the door. I stared at it, waiting for a knock, waiting for the bolt to rattle. Instead, something scraped along the wood, like claws or fingernails being dragged down the doorframe. And then the voice again, my name clearer this time, said twice. It was close enough that it rattled in my chest. I couldn't move. I just sat there, heart racing, throat dry. The scraping stopped, and for a few minutes there was silence. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was my mother's voice. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, and yet outside my cabin door, in the middle of the desert, I heard her calling me like she used to when I was a kid, except it wasn't right. It was strained, hollow, like someone trying too hard to sound human. That was the breaking point. I grabbed my bag, my flashlight, and my car keys. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I wasn't staying another minute. I bolted out the door, shining the flashlight in every direction. The beam caught shapes in the brush, low, crouched figures that ducked away as soon as the light touched them. My stomach dropped. I didn't look closer. I sprinted to the car, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I turned the key, something moved in front of the headlights. A figure stood there, tall and thin, skin stretched tight over bone. It wasn't wearing clothes. Its arms hung too long, its head tilted at a wrong angle. For a split second, its face looked like mine. I floored the gas, swerving past it. My tires kicked up dirt, and I didn't stop driving until I was back on the highway with the cabin miles behind me. I never went back. I never told the man I'd rented it from what I saw, never explained why I left early. For weeks afterward, I kept hearing my name at night, even back in my apartment. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my door, even when no one was there. It's been 20 years now. I don't talk about it much, but I still don't go out into the desert alone. I don't camp, I don't rent cabins, I don't chase silence anymore. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can hear that voice again. Not calling from outside, but whispering from somewhere inside my own head. I started working as a seasonal park ranger in the summer of 1998. I was 24 then, still trying to figure out what to do with my life, and the job seemed like a good fit. The forest was quiet, the pay wasn't great, but the thought of spending days alone among trees and wildlife sounded like the kind of escape I needed. They stationed me in a small cabin on the north side of Bitterwood National Park in Montana. It wasn't one of the big ranger stations, just a single-room cabin with a stove, a cot, a desk, and a radio that crackled more than it worked. My duty was simple: patrol a set of trails, keep an eye out for fires, check permits, and file a nightly report. By mid-July, I had settled into the routine. The days were long and hot, the nights quiet except for the sound of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote. The cabin sat a mile off a gravel road and maybe 6 miles from the nearest town. It had a hand pump well outside, a shed with tools, and an old generator that coughed and rattled when I needed light after sunset. It was on a Friday night when things shifted. The weather had turned earlier that week, with heavy rain that soaked the trails and left the ground soft and muddy. That evening, the air felt heavy, almost like the whole forest was holding its breath. I went through my routine, checked the perimeter, made sure the fire pit near the cabin was cold, logged my notes for the day, then sat on the porch watching the last bit of light fade. When I finally locked the door and turned in, it was close to midnight. The generator had run out of fuel, so I used a lantern, the flame casting soft light on the wooden walls. I remember lying on the cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain begin to tap on the tin roof. It was a slow, steady sound that usually put me to sleep, but something was off that night. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place at first. It wasn't the rain. It was heavier, irregular, like footsteps on wet ground. I stayed still, telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a bear. That wasn't unusual. But then it stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. I sat up, listening hard. The lantern had burned low, the room dim, shadows stretching in the corners. I could hear my own heartbeat more than anything else. Then came the sound again, closer this time. Definite steps. Slow, careful. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I reached under the cot for the rifle we kept for emergencies. It was old, but it worked. My hands felt damp on the stock as I waited. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped right outside the door. The wood creaked faintly as if weight had shifted against it. I didn't move. I just kept staring at the door, watching the lantern flicker. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound was gone. No footsteps retreating, no branches breaking, nothing. I sat there for nearly an hour, rifle in hand, until exhaustion got the better of me. I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe an elk, maybe even a raccoon making more noise than usual. The next morning, I went outside to check. The rain had eased to a drizzle, but the ground was soft and easy to track. Right away, I saw them, prints in the mud, leading up from the tree line to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, a man's, judging by the size. They circled the cabin, stopping at the door, then vanished back into the woods. I followed them a short way, maybe 30 yards, before the trail broke up in thicker brush. My stomach was in knots the whole time. There weren't supposed to be people out here without permits, and the nearest trail was a good mile away. Whoever it was, they had no reason to be near my cabin. I filed my report that afternoon, noting possible trespasser and footprints observed. The radio barely picked up a signal, but I managed to get through to the main station. They told me to keep an eye out and not to engage. That night, I refueled the generator and kept every light in the cabin burning. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the old wood, every gust of wind against the siding set me on edge. By 3 in the morning, I was still awake, staring at the door, rifle across my lap. The third night was worse. I had done my patrols, double-checked the shed, even stacked some extra firewood by the porch to keep myself busy. But when darkness came, the dread came with it. I left the lanterns burning again, tried to read a field manual to distract myself, but my eyes kept shifting to the windows. Around 1 in the morning, the generator sputtered and died. I hadn't filled it enough. The cabin fell into silence, except for the rain hitting the roof. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I'd refill it in the morning. I lit the lantern again, the only source of light. Then I heard it, steps in the mud just like before. Slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin again, dragging out each movement like they knew I was listening. My chest tightened, my breath shallow. I gripped the rifle tighter, eyes locked on the door. This time, though, there was more. A faint scrape on the wall, like fingers trailing along the wood. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, pausing under the window before continuing. I stayed frozen, lantern flickering, stomach twisted in fear. Eventually, the noise faded. I didn't sleep a second after that. First light, I checked again. The same boot prints, fresh in the mud. They circled the cabin, stopped at the window, then vanished back into the trees. My hands shook as I traced them. Whoever it was, they had been inches from me while I sat there, only a thin wall between us. I reported it again, this time more urgent. They promised to send someone up, but with the weather and the distance, I knew it could take days. The following night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat with the rifle, lantern burning, waiting. The footsteps came again, right on time, but this time they didn't just circle. They stopped directly at the door. I watched the handle twitch once, then again like someone was testing it. The lock held, but I thought my heart would break through my chest. I kept the rifle aimed at the door, finger on the trigger, ready for it to burst open. But after a long stretch of silence, the steps retreated, fading into the woods once more. By morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait for backup. I packed my gear, shouldered the rifle, and left the cabin behind. I followed the gravel road out, 6 long miles, my eyes darting to every sound in the trees. When I finally reached town and reported it in person, the rangers promised they'd investigate. They never found anyone, just footprints in the mud, too washed out by the rain to follow. I never went back to that cabin. I quit the job a week later. To this day, I don't know who it was out there or why they came back night after night. All I know is that someone had been watching me, circling that cabin in the dark, waiting for a chance to come inside, and I wasn't about to give them one. It had been raining since early evening, a steady downpour that turned the dirt tracks into thick mud and made every tree drip like it was sweating. I was 34 years old at the time, and I had driven myself far outside of town into the backwoods of northern Arkansas, trying to make some kind of fresh start. It was the year 2009, and I had bought a small patch of cheap land that didn't come with much. Just a clearing surrounded by forest and an old rusted trailer I had no interest in living inside. My plan was simple. I was going to build myself a small cabin, just enough for me, something I could work on with my own hands, away from the noise and mess of the city. By the time I hauled the last load of supplies from my truck that night, the rain had soaked through my jacket and dripped down into my boots. The air was thick, heavy, and every sound carried strangely in the wet dark. Branches snapping far off, water pouring from the gutters of trees, a frog croaking deep in the ditch. I dragged the tarp-covered lumber to the spot where I had marked out the foundation earlier that week. The ground was uneven and soft, my boots sinking into it with every step. I had set cinder blocks as a base, and they sat there now like little gray teeth pushing up through the mud. The rain made everything harder. My hammer slipped in my hand, nails bent, wood swelled. I had a small lantern with me, the kind that gave off a faint orange glow, but the rain kept spitting across its glass and making the light flicker. I worked fast, partly to stay warm, partly to push through the unease building inside me. I was alone out there, and that was the whole point, but at night in the woods, with rain falling steady, alone takes on a heavier meaning. I had managed to get the frame up before the rain grew heavier. The walls rose like dark bones, thin but steady, and I nailed boards into place until my hands ached. My clothes clung to me and my hair stuck against my forehead. Every few minutes I stopped, bent forward, and just listened. The forest around me never went quiet. Something always moved, water dripping, leaves shivering, the low groan of branches as they swayed. But that night, there was something different about the sounds. It wasn't just the usual shifting of the woods. There were cracks in the distance, not like branches falling, but like the deliberate crunch of footsteps moving slow. I told myself it was animals. Out here, deer, raccoons, coyotes, any of them could make those noises. Still, I felt it. That creeping awareness that you aren't as alone as you thought. I pushed the thought aside and focused on the cabin. The roof beams came next. I balanced them one by one, my hands trembling from the wet and the cold. I could barely see now, the lantern only lighting a narrow circle while the rain ate away the edges of it. Beyond that little bubble of light was only black, thick, endless. I felt blind to what might be out there. When I was halfway through the roof, I heard it again. A crunch closer this time. Wet leaves pressed down slow. My head turned, and I stared into the dark. Nothing, just dripping branches. My heart pounded hard against my ribs. I grabbed the hammer tighter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was the only solid thing in my hand. I tried to ignore it, forced myself to keep working, nails slipping against the wood as my fingers stiffened. My stomach felt hollow. The rain pattered on my back, heavier now, sheets of it falling. The lantern hissed once as drops hit its flame, and for a second I thought it would die out. The light wavered, then steadied again. I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding. The sound came again, but this time closer, sharper, like someone stepping on a thick branch and snapping it underfoot. I froze, hammer in one hand, a wet piece of lumber in the other. The sound hadn't come from deep in the woods. It had come from near the edge of the clearing. I squinted, trying to see, but the rain blurred everything into shifting shadows. Minutes passed. My ears strained against the downpour. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe a branch really had fallen. Maybe a raccoon was digging through the mud. But the longer I stood there, the less I believed it. I set the lumber down slow and picked up the lantern. The light was weak, but I raised it and walked toward the edge of the clearing. The mud sucked at my boots as I moved. My shoulders were tight, my breath shallow. I swept the lantern left to right, the glow sliding over tree trunks slick with rain. Nothing but trees and mud and water. I turned back toward the cabin frame, trying to calm myself. That was when I saw it. In the mud between the trees, not 20 feet from where I had been working, was a footprint. A human one. The rain had already started to blur its edges, but it was clear enough. Larger than mine, pressed deep, fresh. My chest tightened as if the air had been punched out of me. Someone had been standing there. Someone had been close enough to watch me. My eyes darted around the tree line, searching for movement, a figure, anything. But there was nothing now, just the steady rain. I backed up slow toward the cabin frame, the lantern shaking in my grip. My head kept turning, scanning the dark, every muscle in my body ready to jump. I reached the cabin and set the lantern down inside the half-built frame. The glow pushed against the night, but it didn't reach far. The work was over. I couldn't keep building, not with that footprint fresh in the mud. My mind ran through what I should do. Get to the truck, drive out, come back in daylight. But the truck was parked down the muddy track, and the thought of walking back through the trees in the dark with someone out there watching made my stomach churn. Instead, I stayed inside the skeleton of the cabin. I dragged some of the lumber against the open doorway, stacked it as a kind of barrier, flimsy as it was. I crouched low near the lantern, hammer still in my grip, every nerve tight. The rain roared on the frame above me, dripping through the gaps, running down the wood, but all I could hear was my heartbeat. The hours passed slow. I didn't sleep, couldn't even close my eyes. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every shift of shadow made me grip the hammer tighter. I stared at the opening again and again, waiting for something to move, for someone to step through. But nothing ever did. By the time the sky finally began to pale, my clothes were stiff with cold and my body ached from crouching. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and stepped out into the clearing. The rain had eased to a mist, a thin silver fog hanging between the trees. I walked to where I had seen the footprint. It was almost gone now, blurred into a puddle, but I could still make it out. I wasn't wrong. Someone had been there. I scanned the ground for more, but the rain had done its work. Nothing else remained. No trail to follow, no clue of where they had gone. Whoever had stood there had melted back into the woods as silent as they had come. I left the cabin half-finished that morning. I carried the lantern, packed my tools fast, and trudged back to the truck. The clearing behind me looked smaller in daylight, harmless even, but I knew what I had seen. That footprint was real. When I drove away, the tires slipping in the mud, I knew I wouldn't come back alone. The cabin would wait. I'd bring someone next time, anyone, because I had learned something that night I couldn't ignore. The woods don't always keep you company the way you expect. Sometimes, someone is out there watching, quiet and patient, waiting for the rain to hide their steps. And the worst part was not knowing if they would come back. It was late October of 1998 when I drove out to a small town in rural Pennsylvania, far away from where I had grown up. I was 28 then, still restless, still wanting to prove to myself I could survive alone in places most people wouldn't dare to spend the night. I had read about an old caretaker's cabin that sat just outside the boundary of a graveyard, a place that had been left to rot after the cemetery stopped paying someone to live there. I had time off from work, and with nothing better to do, I told myself I would stay there a few nights just to see what it felt like, away from everything. No noise, no city, no one to distract me. The directions I had scribbled on a piece of paper were vague, and it took me nearly an hour of driving down narrow dirt roads to find it. The cabin was small, weathered, leaning slightly to one side as though its bones were tired. The wood siding was gray and cracked, with patches of moss crawling up from the foundation. The roof sagged, a few shingles missing, and the single chimney leaned a little too far to the left. It looked like it had been sitting there for decades, untouched except by the weather. Right behind it stretched rows of headstones, some tilted, some broken, others swallowed by weeds. The graveyard looked older than the cabin, like it had been there since the 1800s. Many of the markers were barely legible, carved names and dates worn down by years of rain and frost. The whole place carried a heavy silence. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move there. I parked my car a little ways down the dirt track, pulled my backpack out, and walked up to the cabin. The door creaked hard when I pushed it open, and the smell inside was sharp, old wood, mildew, and something sour that reminded me of damp soil. The floor sagged in a few spots, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. A broken chair sat against one wall, and a rusted iron bed frame leaned in another, its mattress long gone. It wasn't much, but I told myself it was fine. I wasn't looking for comfort. I had my sleeping bag, a lantern, and enough food to last me a few days. By the time I set up, the sun was dipping low. I walked through the graveyard just to get a sense of it. The ground was uneven, soft in places where it shouldn't have been, and I had to watch my footing. Some graves had sunken in, creating shallow dips that looked like small pits in the earth. The newer stones, if you could call them that, were from the 1950s. Beyond that, most of the names belonged to people who had died in the 1800s. I didn't know their stories, but standing among them gave me a strange feeling, like I was trespassing somewhere private. When night came, I lit the lantern inside the cabin. The light barely reached the corners, and every creak of the wood made me more aware of how alone I was. I lay down in my sleeping bag on the floorboards, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. For a while, I thought I heard the faint sound of something moving outside, but I told myself it was just the wind pushing through the trees or an animal passing by. Around midnight, I woke up with my heart pounding. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I realized I had heard a sound. A low, steady scraping, like metal on stone, came from outside, close, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I stayed still, listening. It lasted for a few minutes, then stopped. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that graveyards attract animals too. A raccoon or stray dog could have been digging around one of the graves. Still, the sound had been sharp, deliberate, not random scratching. The next morning, I went out to check. The ground was wet with dew, and the grass clung to my boots. I walked through the rows until I saw something strange near one of the older graves. The earth around it was disturbed, not like it had been dug up, but like something had been clawed or scraped across the dirt. The headstone nearby had deep, fresh marks running down the side, uneven lines as if someone had dragged a metal tool across it. I crouched down and touched the grooves. They were rough, jagged. Too deep for an animal, I thought. It bothered me more than I wanted to admit. There weren't any houses nearby, no reason for anyone to come out there in the middle of the night. That second night, I couldn't relax. I sat up longer, keeping the lantern on, listening. The woods were dead quiet, no insects, no owls, nothing. When I finally drifted off, it was shallow, uneasy sleep. At some point, I woke again, this time to a dull thudding sound, rhythmic, like someone hitting the ground with something heavy. It was close, maybe right behind the cabin. My stomach tightened, and I stayed frozen in my bag, holding my breath. After a while, it stopped, and the silence rushed back in. In the morning, I went around back. There, in the damp dirt not far from the rear wall of the cabin, I found footprints. They weren't mine. These were longer, wider, pressed deep into the soil, barefoot. Whoever had made them had been walking around in the dark without shoes. My skin crawled as I traced them. They led toward the graveyard, then vanished among the grass and uneven ground. I told myself to pack up and leave. I even rolled up my sleeping bag and stuffed half my things back into my backpack. But then I stopped. I had come all this way to test myself, to spend a few nights alone. If I left after just 2 nights, it would feel like I had failed. So I stayed. The third night was worse. I kept the lantern burning as long as I could. But fuel doesn't last forever. Once it dimmed and went out, I lay in total darkness. Every sound seemed sharper, every groan of the old wood louder. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again, the scraping. Not distant this time, but right against the side of the cabin wall, just a few feet from where I was lying. Long, slow drags, like metal pulling across the wood. My heart hammered so hard I thought whoever or whatever was outside would hear it. I sat completely still until the noise stopped. Then, after several minutes of silence, I heard light footsteps moving away, crunching through the grass toward the graveyard. I didn't sleep after that. When dawn came, I forced myself outside. The side of the cabin was scarred. Fresh grooves carved into the old wood, matching what I had seen on the headstone. Whatever was out there, it had been testing the walls while I was inside. I didn't bother checking the graveyard again. I grabbed my things, stuffed everything back into the pack, and carried it to the car. My hands shook the whole time, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from between the headstones. I drove away without looking back. Even now, years later, I can picture the marks on that cabin, the footprints in the dirt, the deliberate sounds in the middle of the night. I tell myself it was probably someone living out there, maybe hiding near the graveyard, someone who didn't want me staying in that cabin. That's the only explanation that makes sense. But I can't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been waiting, circling, testing the walls, trying to see how long I would last before breaking. I lasted 3 nights. That was enough. I hadn't been back near that road in almost 15 years. It was the kind of place I told myself I'd never have to see again. But life has a way of pulling you back to the same corners you thought you escaped from. My ex-wife, Sarah, used to live in that cabin tucked back in the trees, past the long dirt road that ran parallel to the creek. I drove by it once last week after taking a wrong turn coming back from a construction site outside town. Just seeing the roofline through the branches was enough to stir something heavy inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to it. The smell of pine needles and wood smoke. The way the boards on the porch always groaned under weight. The cold mornings when frost gathered on the windows. But mixed with those memories was something sharper. Something I hadn't shaken since the last time I stepped foot there. Something about that place had always made me uneasy, even before the divorce. On Friday, I decided to drive back out there again. It was September of 2017, the air already cooler in the evenings. I told myself I was only curious, just checking if the place was even still standing. But deep down, I think I wanted to prove to myself that the unease I'd carried all these years had no weight. The road leading in was narrower than I remembered, choked by overgrown brush on either side. The gravel had thinned out, patches of dirt and weeds breaking through. The farther I drove, the more I realized no one had been keeping it up. The forest pressed in, taller than it used to be, and sunlight barely cut through the branches overhead. When the cabin came into sight, my chest tightened. The roof sagged, part of it caved near the back corner. The porch railings leaned outward like brittle bones. The paint, once a deep brown, had faded to a sickly gray. The windows looked like dead eyes. I pulled over and cut the engine. The silence hit me like a wall. No sound of birds, no rustle of wind, just stillness. I sat for a while, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the front door that I used to walk through every night after work. Eventually, I stepped out. The ground crunched beneath my boots, and the smell of damp earth rose up. The air felt colder near the cabin, even though it wasn't late in the day yet. I walked up to the porch. The wood groaned beneath me, same as it always had, but weaker now, as if each board was one step away from snapping. The door wasn't locked, pushed open with a dry creak. Inside, the cabin looked frozen in time and destroyed all at once. The furniture was still there, but everything sagged with mold and rot. The old sofa, where I had sat so many nights watching rain streak down the windows, was half collapsed. The rug was damp and smelled of mildew. The kitchen counters were scattered with broken glass and mouse droppings. I walked slowly through the rooms, my chest heavy. I remembered arguments in this very space, nights when silence between us was louder than shouting. The bedroom door was open, the bed still there, frame broken, mattress blackened by water damage. As I moved deeper inside, I noticed something that made me stop cold. In the corner near the fireplace, there was a pile of wood. Not rotten, not old. Freshly cut logs stacked neatly. I crouched down, touched one. It was clean, the bark still firm, and it couldn't have been more than a week old. Someone had been here. That thought shot through me like ice water. The whole drive, I'd assumed the place was abandoned, untouched for years, but that would meant otherwise. Someone had not only been here but was still keeping the cabin alive, in a way. I moved toward the back door, where the roof had caved in, and saw footprints in the dirt outside. They weren't old. The rain earlier that week had left the soil soft, and these tracks were sharp, leading away from the cabin into the tree line. I told myself I should turn around, walk back to the truck, and drive off without looking back. But I didn't. Instead, I followed the tracks. The forest behind the cabin was darker, thicker. The air smelled of wet leaves and something sour underneath. I walked carefully, every sound of snapping twigs under my boots making my neck stiffen. The tracks wound through the trees and then split. One set went deeper into the woods, the other circled back toward the cabin. That was when I noticed something else. Nails driven into the bark of trees at chest height. Hanging from each was a strip of fabric, some frayed and sun-bleached, others looking newer. Shirts, scraps of coats, pieces of cloth I didn't recognize. They swayed slightly in the still air, like they had been hung there on purpose. My throat tightened. I backed away, eyes scanning between the trees. That was when I saw the rusted metal drum, half buried in leaves. The lid was off and inside were bones. Animal bones, I told myself right away. They had to be, but the longer I stared, the less sure I was. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I turned, ready to get out of there, but movement caught my eye. Down the slope, maybe 50 yards away, a shape shifted between the trees. Someone was standing there, still as stone, watching. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew they were looking at me. I didn't wait. I backed up fast, nearly tripping over roots, then turned and hurried toward the cabin. I cut across the yard, boots thudding against the porch as I shoved myself back through the front door and out the other side. My chest heaved, lungs burning, but I didn't stop until I was back at the truck. I fumbled with the keys, dropped them once, then finally got the engine roaring. Gravel spat out behind me as I tore down the road, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. The tree line seemed alive, shifting, as if more than one person could have been standing there. When I finally hit the paved road, I didn't slow down. I drove until the cabin was miles behind me, my hands still shaking on the wheel. That night, I sat in my apartment with the lights on, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I told myself I must have imagined some of it, that fear had twisted what I saw into something worse. But no matter how I tried to reason it, I couldn't shake the sight of that fresh-cut wood, the strips of fabric on the trees, or the figure standing in the shadows. The cabin hadn't been abandoned. Someone was out there, living in the ruins of my past, shaping that place into something else, something I wasn't meant to see. I haven't gone back since, and I won't. That cabin doesn't belong to Sarah anymore, and it doesn't belong to me. Whoever claims it now can keep it. I know better than to step foot near it again. And every time I drive in that direction, I take the long way around, even if it adds an hour. Because I know if I pass that road again, I might see more than just a roof through the trees. I might see them waiting. It was the fall of 2014 when I drove up into the hills of northern Montana with my dog, a 2-year-old German Shepherd named Rex. I had taken a week off work and decided to spend it at a small cabin I had fixed up a few years back. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a small loft. No electricity except for a generator I barely used, and a wood stove that kept the place warm. I liked it that way. It felt separate from everything, far enough away from town that I could breathe, yet close enough that I could still get back if I needed to. The cabin sat about 30 miles from the nearest paved road, down a dirt track that twisted through thick pines and narrow valleys. That first day was calm. The air was sharp and cold, the ground covered with a thin layer of frost that crunched under my boots as I carried in firewood. Rex wandered the perimeter of the cabin, his ears perked, tail stiff, nose constantly low to the ground. He was always alert out there, more serious than he ever was back home. Dogs pick up things we don't, and in the woods I trusted his instincts more than mine. The plan was simple: relax, hunt a little, and just get away from noise. I stacked wood by the door, checked the roofline for leaks, and made sure the little propane tank for cooking was still full. By late afternoon, I had the stove going, the inside warm, and Rex curled on his blanket by the door. It was quiet except for the occasional crack of branches outside. But that night, something shifted. Around midnight, I woke up to Rex standing at the door, stiff and silent. Normally he growled or barked if something was near, but this time he didn't make a sound. His body was rigid, tail down, ears forward. I listened. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the wind. Then I heard it, a slow crunch of footsteps in the frost. It wasn't an animal moving fast or light. It was heavy, measured. One step, pause, another step. I stayed still on my cot, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was probably an elk or maybe a moose wandering through. But the longer it went on, the more wrong it felt. The steps circled the cabin, dragging across the leaves and frost, sometimes close to the wall, sometimes further out. Rex never moved, just followed the sound with his head, body locked tight. After a few minutes, the steps faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. The ground was frozen enough that prints weren't clear, but I found faint depressions in the frost. Longer, more even than any deer or elk. They looked like boot tracks, faint but enough to unsettle me. I brushed it off, told myself it was nothing, maybe an old hunter passing through. The day carried on like normal. I spent it chopping wood and walking with Rex along the creek about half a mile away. The sun was low by 4, shadows cutting through the trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped moving, the forest seemed to press in around me. Rex would stop too, ears up, staring into the trees, but he never barked. It was like he knew something was out there and didn't want to draw attention to it. That second night was worse. I tried to sleep but woke to Rex growling low in his throat. Not barking, growling. His eyes were locked on the small window above the sink. I turned my head toward it, and though it was dark, I swore I saw movement outside, just a faint shadow shifting against the dim light of the moon. My heart slammed in my chest. I slid off the cot and crouched low, trying not to make a sound. The cabin felt too small all of a sudden, too thin to keep anything out. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat in the chair with my rifle across my lap, Rex lying against my leg, still watching that window. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it again, those slow, steady footsteps circling the cabin. Then they stopped right by the door. Whoever it was just stood there. Rex's growl deepened, but I kept my hand on his neck to quiet him. The sound of breathing came next, faint but clear in the silence, like someone was leaning against the door itself. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the steps moved off again into the trees. When the sun finally came up, I was exhausted, running on nerves and little sleep. I stepped outside with the rifle, scanning the tree line. The frost near the door was disturbed. Fresh boot prints, larger than mine, circling in patterns. Someone had been there, no doubt about it now. I thought about leaving that morning, packing up and driving out, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself maybe it was some drifter, maybe just someone passing through. But deep down I knew better. Whoever it was had come 2 nights in a row, and they weren't just passing. They were watching. That night I prepared. I kept the lantern low, rifle loaded, and Rex close. I sat by the stove, every sound from outside amplified in my ears. Around midnight, it came again. The crunch of boots, the pause, the slow circling. Rex pressed against the door this time, his teeth bared. I could hear the faint creak of wood as someone tested the window frame. That was enough for me. I yanked the door open and stepped out with the rifle raised, yelling into the dark. The forest swallowed my voice, and for a split second, I caught movement. Someone slipping between the trees, tall, dark, fast. Rex lunged forward, barking for the first time, but I pulled him back. I didn't fire. I just stood there shaking, heart hammering in my chest. I stayed awake until dawn, and the moment light touched the treetops, I packed. I didn't care about the week I planned. I shoved my gear into the truck, Rex jumping into the passenger seat without hesitation. When I drove down the dirt road, I checked the mirror more than the windshield. About 10 miles out, I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed it. In the thin frost on the hood of my truck were marks. 5 long streaks, like fingers had dragged across it while I slept the night before. Whoever had been out there had come close, closer than I ever realized. I never went back to that cabin. A month later, I sold the land, papers signed without hesitation. People asked why, but I never gave them the full story. I just said I was done with it. But the truth is clear to me. Someone had been watching me out there, night after night, patient, careful, and deliberate. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I would have gotten out at all. Even now, years later, when Rex shifts in his sleep or perks his ears toward the door, I still get that same tight feeling in my chest, like I'm back in that cabin with nothing but thin walls and a stranger walking slow circles outside in the frost. I was 32 when I went back to my grandmother's cabin after she died. She had lived alone for nearly 20 years up in the northern part of Michigan, tucked into the thick woods about an hour outside a small town called Ironwood. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years. The drive itself felt long and quiet, just trees and empty roads, and the closer I got, the less cell service I had. By the time I turned onto the gravel path that led to her property, my phone was basically useless. The cabin was small, built of dark wood, with a tin roof that always echoed when it rained. I remembered visiting as a kid, spending weekends there with her, the smell of old pine and the way the boards creaked underfoot. She was a quiet woman, always keeping things simple, never throwing anything out. After she passed away, the cabin was left to me. My mother had told me I should go and check on it, maybe decide if I wanted to sell it or keep it. When I pulled up, the grass was tall, and the gravel driveway was partly eaten away by weeds. The cabin stood still, almost hidden by the trees, like it was being swallowed up. The wooden steps sagged, and the front door looked dry and cracked. I parked the truck and sat for a few minutes, just staring at it. I couldn't explain it, but I felt uneasy, like something was pressing down on my chest. Maybe it was just the weight of memories, maybe it was being there alone, but I didn't want to get out. When I finally did, the air smelled heavy, damp, almost metallic. My boots crunched the gravel, and I carried a box of supplies inside. Flashlights, batteries, some food, and my sleeping bag. The power lines had been disconnected years ago, and there was no running water. Everything about the place was stuck in time. Inside, the cabin smelled stale. Dust floated in the sunlight that pushed through the dirty windows. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. The small living room still had her old rocking chair near the wood stove, and the table where she used to shell peas was stacked with yellowed newspapers. Every surface was crowded with things. Jars of buttons, folded towels, cracked mugs, and piles of clothes too worn out to wear. I walked through slowly, my dog following at my heels, sniffing the air. The floor groaned with every step. In the bedroom, her bed was still made, thin quilt tucked in neat corners, pillows flat with age. There was a jar of medicine bottles on the dresser, labels faded. I felt strange standing in there, like I was intruding on something private, even though she was gone. I decided I would stay the night just to see what it felt like. I set up my sleeping bag in the main room, closer to the door. As daylight faded, I chopped some wood and got a small fire going in the stove. The crackle and warmth made the place feel less empty, but the shadows stretched long and dark against the walls. When night fully came, it was silent. No cars, no voices, just the sound of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. My dog lay next to me, ears twitching. I tried to relax, but every time the wind pushed against the cabin, I felt my body tense. Around midnight, I heard something outside, soft footsteps in the gravel or maybe the leaves. My dog's head lifted, eyes fixed on the door. My heart started racing. I sat still, listening. The steps came closer, then stopped. I thought about calling out, but I didn't want to make a sound. I grabbed the flashlight and waited, pointing it toward the door. Minutes passed, and nothing else happened. My dog eventually laid his head back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp, and sure enough, there were prints in the dirt near the porch. They weren't mine and they weren't animal. They looked like boot prints, heading toward the cabin and then turning away back into the woods. I stood there staring at them, my stomach tight. I tried to convince myself it was just some hunter passing through or maybe a local cutting across the property. But it didn't sit right with me. This cabin was deep enough in the woods that people didn't just wander by. The second night was worse. Couldn't sleep at all. Around the same time, close to midnight, I heard the sounds again, this time around the back of the cabin. My dog growled low, staring at the window. I held my breath, every nerve in me tight. I heard the faintest scrape, like metal against wood, and then silence. In the morning, I found fresh scratches on the back door, near the lock. Not deep, but enough to show someone had tried to mess with it. That was when the fear settled heavy in me. Someone had been out there both nights, circling the cabin, testing doors. I thought about leaving, packing up and driving off, but part of me didn't want to run. This place was mine now, and it felt like if I left, I'd never come back. So I stayed, though every hour felt longer than it should. That third night, I sat with the flashlight and an axe next to me. I didn't even try to sleep. My dog paced back and forth, uneasy. It was past midnight when the sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps on the gravel, crunching closer. My chest felt tight. I kept the fire low so the room was dim. The steps came right up to the porch. I could hear the wood creak under weight. My dog started barking, sharp and loud, and I snapped the flashlight on, pointing it at the door. Whoever it was didn't try to come in. The steps moved quickly, retreating, fading back into the woods. I didn't chase. I just sat there frozen, listening until the silence returned. At dawn, I found more boot prints, circling the cabin like someone had been walking laps around it. I also found a cigarette, but near the edge of the porch, still damp from the dew. My grandmother never smoked, and neither did I. Someone had stood there watching, close enough to see right inside. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin was too isolated, and whoever had been creeping around wasn't gonna stop. I packed my things quickly, loaded the truck, and didn't look back as I drove down the gravel road. My dog stayed close, quiet, almost as if he understood the relief I felt leaving. When I reached the town, I went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, showed them the cigarette I had picked up. They said they would check it out, but I could tell from their faces they didn't expect much. Out there, in the woods, things like that happened. People wandered, some squatted in empty cabins, some just looked for trouble. I never went back to the cabin after that. I sold the property a year later, sight unseen. Sometimes I think about my grandmother, how she lived out there all alone for so many years. I wonder if she ever heard the same sounds at night, if she ever saw the prints in the dirt and just never told anyone. The cabin is gone from my life now, but I still think about those nights, about the heavy silence and the steps on the gravel. The thought that someone stood outside, watching me through the windows, waiting for the right moment, still knots my stomach. It wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was worse. It was real. I never meant to end up at that cabin. It was late September of 2003. I was 27 at the time, and I had taken a few days off work to clear my head. I lived in northern Michigan then, and I thought some time out in the woods would help. I liked hiking alone, just me and the sound of the trees. No phones, no people, no distractions. I brought a small pack with food, water, a flashlight, and a thin sleeping bag just in case. I planned on sticking to the trails near Alpena, not going too far from the main roads. But as the day wore on, I found myself pushing deeper than I'd planned. By mid-afternoon, the sky had that gray look it gets before a storm. The wind moved differently, colder, carrying the smell of rain. I figured I'd head back toward the highway before the weather hit. But the trails out there twist and fork in ways you don't always notice until it's too late. I took one wrong turn, then another, and before I knew it, the trees had closed in around me, tall and crowded, blocking what little light there was. That's when I saw it. Through the brush, maybe 100 yards away, stood a cabin. The wood was dark, almost black from age and weather. The roof sagged in the middle, like the spine of something old and tired. There was no smoke from a chimney, no sign of life. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. But the thought of staying outside in the rain wasn't a good one, so I figured I'd at least check if it could give me some cover. The door was half rotted, hanging off rusted hinges. When I pushed it open, the sound echoed sharp against the emptiness inside. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, like mold mixed with old smoke. The floor was warped in spots, the boards uneven under my boots. There was a table in the center, covered in a thick layer of dust, and a broken chair lying on its side. In one corner, I saw an old metal bed frame, the mattress long gone, just a few torn scraps of fabric clinging to the springs. I set my pack down, listening. The woods outside had gone still, the way they sometimes do before a storm. Inside the cabin, the quiet pressed in heavy. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should have. I tried to steady myself, telling my mind it was only an old, empty cabin, nothing more. The rain started not long after, came hard, beating against the roof, dripping through gaps in the boards. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall, chewing on a granola bar, watching water streak down the dirty window glass. For a while, I tried to relax, but the longer I sat there, the more I noticed little details that unsettled me. There were deep scratches in the wood of the door frame, not from weather or rot, but from something deliberate. On the table, beneath the dust, faint rings showed where glasses or jars had been set down again and again, like someone had once spent long nights drinking there. And near the fireplace, I found a pair of old boots, cracked leather stiff with age, but they weren't rotted all the way through. Someone had left them not decades ago, but maybe only a few years. I told myself it didn't matter. People leave things behind.
Kabinsrot.
Time moves on, but the more I looked, the more the cabin felt less abandoned and more interrupted, like whoever used it had left in a hurry. Night came faster than I expected. The storm outside swallowed the last bit of light, and the cabin dropped into darkness. I used my flashlight sparingly, the weak beam bouncing off the walls, catching on cobwebs and splintered wood. The rain hammered the roof, and the wind pushed through cracks, whistling in short, sharp bursts. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong to storm or wind, a heavy thud from somewhere outside, followed by the crunch of wet ground under weight. My chest tightened, every hair on my body standing up. I turned off the flashlight instantly, my breathing loud in the sudden dark.
I sat frozen, listening.
Another step, slower this time, circling the cabin. The boards of the porch creaked under the weight of something or someone moving across it. Then silence again. I waited, minutes dragging like hours, until my legs started to cramp. My mind spun with thoughts. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe even a bear. But bears don't walk across porches like that. And they don't stop to stand still the way this did. When I finally dared to move, I crawled to the window and peered out through the cracked glass. The rain blurred everything into streaks, but I swear I caught the shape of something standing between the trees, too still to be an animal. Broad shoulders, figure. I dropped back down, heart slamming in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If it was a person, why were they standing out there in the rain, watching? Why hadn't they called out? I stayed on the floor most of the night, flashlight gripped tight in my hand, listening for every scrape and shift outside. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, the storm had passed. Pale morning light pushed through the cracks in the walls. The cabin was silent again. I packed my things quickly, ready to leave that place behind. But when I opened the door, I froze. In the mud just off the porch, clear as day, were footprints. Not boot prints, but bare feet. Large, wide, pressed deep into the wet earth. They led from the trees to the porch, circled the cabin, then disappeared back into the woods. I didn't waste another second. I took off in the direction I thought the highway was, moving as fast as I could manage through the undergrowth. The forest felt tighter now, every shadow heavy, every sound sharp. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to think. I just kept moving, kept pushing until at last I heard the faint sound of cars in the distance. When I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the shoulder of the highway, the relief was so strong it nearly knocked me down. I never looked back into the woods. I just kept walking along the road until a passing truck picked me up. I've been back to those trails since, but never that deep. And I never found that cabin again, no matter how far I searched. Maybe it rotted away. Maybe I simply lost the path to it. But I'll never forget the prints in the mud, or the way someone or something stood just far enough back in the trees, watching me in silence all night long. That was the last time I ever stepped inside an abandoned cabin. Some places, I learned, aren't meant to be shelter. They're meant to be left alone. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to get away from the noise of Manchester. I had been working long weeks at a job that never seemed to end, and when I saw an old wooden cabin listed for rent in Northumberland, tucked away in the hills, I booked it without thinking twice. It was said to be remote, no neighbors for miles, no phone service once you got past the winding country road. That was exactly what I thought I needed: quiet, peace, and time to clear my head. The drive there was long, past sheep fields and stone walls that looked like they had been there for centuries. The road grew narrower, almost more like a path than a proper road. When I finally pulled up at the cabin, it was smaller than the photos had shown, leaning slightly to one side, with weathered wood that had turned gray from years of rain and wind. The grass around it was overgrown, and there were weeds pushing up through the gravel. Still, it was mine for a week, and I convinced myself it was charming in its own way. Inside was simple: a wood stove, a creaky old bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a single narrow window looking out toward the trees. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, and there were cobwebs in the corners. I set my bag down and tried to settle in. I had brought books, some food, and thought I would spend most of my time hiking and writing in a journal I had neglected for years. The first night passed quietly, though I hardly slept. The silence in that place was heavier than I was used to. In the city, there was always some hum of life: cars, voices, sirens far off. But here it was only the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional knock of wood contracting in the cabin's frame. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling beams, trying to remind myself I had come here for the silence. The second day I went out walking. The hills rolled endlessly, and I followed a sheep trail that curved up and disappeared into the mist. The air was cool, damp, the kind that soaked into your clothes even without rain. I didn't see another person all day, which at first felt freeing, but as the hours went by, it began to weigh on me. The world felt emptied out, like it was only me and the land, and that thought made me uneasy. That night was when I first saw her. It must have been close to midnight. I had been lying in bed, restless, when I thought I heard something outside. At first I dismissed it as an animal, but the sound came again. Slow, deliberate crunches on gravel, like footsteps. My chest tightened. I sat up and listened, holding my breath. The cabin had only one small window, and the curtains were thin. Against the faint glow of the moon, I saw movement. There was a figure standing out there. A woman. She wasn't moving, only standing, angled just slightly away but close enough that I could make out details. She wore a long coat that reached past her knees, heavy and dark, though the summer air didn't call for it. Her hair looked wet, strands hanging against her face. I couldn't see her features clearly, just the pale skin catching the moonlight. She stood with her hands down at her sides, facing the cabin, not knocking, not calling out, not leaving. I sat frozen on the bed, my mouth dry, my heart hammering in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was someone lost, a hiker maybe, but nothing about her made sense. Who would be walking alone in the hills at this hour? Why hadn't I heard her approach until she was directly outside? I didn't move, and after what felt like forever, I lay back down slowly, hoping if I stayed quiet she would go away. My eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling, and I listened. The crunch of footsteps came again, moving slowly away this time. When I finally forced myself to look, the spot outside the window was empty. The next morning, I told myself it had to have been my imagination. I had been tired, half asleep, maybe I had dreamed it, but when I stepped outside, I froze. In the gravel leading up to the cabin, there were footprints. They were narrow, pointed at the toes, pressed deep into the damp earth. They stopped directly in front of my window. I packed a bag that morning, thinking I might leave early, but when I checked my phone, there was still no signal. The drive back would take hours, and I didn't want to admit to myself that I was running from shadows. I forced myself to stay, distracting myself with long walks and reading, though I couldn't focus on a single page. The second night, I stayed up late with the lamp on, too afraid to turn it off. Every creak of the cabin made my body tense. At some point, I must have dozed in the chair by the window because I woke with a start. The lamp had burned out, leaving only darkness. My skin prickled as I realized what had woken me. She was there again, this time closer, standing almost flush against the window. I could see her face now, pale and expressionless, eyes shadowed under the messy strands of her hair. Her coat looked heavier than before, almost dripping as though soaked through. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. My stomach knotted so tight I thought I might be sick. I couldn't make myself move, couldn't make a sound. I sat in the chair, staring at her, my body locked. Seconds dragged into minutes. Then, without warning, she stepped back, turned, and walked into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there until the sun rose, gripping the arms of the chair, jumping at every sound. By the third day, I was done. I didn't care about peace or quiet or the money I had paid. I packed everything into my bag, slammed the cabin door behind me, and threw my things in the car. My hands shook as I tried to get the key into the ignition. I was halfway down the gravel road before I even looked in the rearview mirror. She was standing at the edge of the trees, right where the road bent out of sight. Her coat hung heavy, her face pale and still, and though the car jolted over the rough track, I swear her head turned to follow me as I drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main road miles away. Only then did I let myself breathe, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers hurt. I didn't look back again, not once. I never went back for the deposit I had left. I never told anyone what I had seen. Even now, years later, I can still picture her face through that thin curtain, the way she stood in the night like she had been waiting for me all along. And the worst part isn't that she was there. The worst part is how quiet she was. No words, no knock, no sound but her feet in the gravel, moving closer, then fading away. That silence has stayed with me long after the hills, the cabin, and the summer of 2016 are gone. I was 27 when I decided to take a break from the city and spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Iowa. It was the spring of 1998, and I had been burning myself out at work in Des Moines. My uncle had stopped farming years ago, and the cabin was more of a forgotten storage place than a home, but he still kept it standing. He gave me the keys, told me there was no running water, but that the pump out back still worked, and that the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles down the gravel road. That isolation was what I wanted, or at least that's what I thought I wanted. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a square wooden building with a tin roof that echoed every raindrop like a drum. Inside there was one main room with a wood stove, a table, and a narrow cot in the corner. The boards creaked under my boots when I walked, and everything smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and the faint sourness of mice that had probably made their way in during the winter. Outside, the farm stretched into endless flat fields, broken up by old fence posts leaning at odd angles. The barn behind the cabin was collapsing in on itself, the roof sagging low enough that I didn't dare step inside. During the day, it was peaceful. I cut wood, hauled water, and sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee while the wind moved through the tall grass. But nights were different. The silence wasn't comforting. It was thick, heavy, almost unnatural. No city hum, no cars passing, no voices. Just black fields stretching forever, and the cabin sitting like a dot of light in the middle of it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I'd get used to it. But by the fourth night, I noticed things that didn't sit right. The first was the sound of footsteps in the field. I had been lying in bed, drifting, when I heard the crunch of something moving across the dry soil outside. Slow steps, not the scatter of an animal, not the scratching of raccoons or coyotes. Heavy, careful steps like a person. I sat up, my chest tight, straining to listen. The steps moved along the side of the cabin, paused near the window, then faded. I told myself it was the wind pushing something across the dirt. I wanted badly to believe that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for prints, but the ground was hard and packed from years of farm trucks. Nothing showed. Still, I kept my eyes on the fields more often that day. The wide openness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt watched. By the end of the first week, I started sleeping less. The nights were too long. I would hear things, footsteps again, faint tapping against the walls, sometimes the sound of something brushing against the window. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move across the yard when the moonlight hit it right, tall and thin, cutting across the dirt. I stayed inside with the lanterns burning, gripping the axe I kept by the stove. One night, I made the mistake of stepping outside. I had convinced myself I was overreacting, that I needed to clear my head. The sky was cloudless, the stars sharp and countless. I walked to the pump, about 15 yards from the cabin, and bent to fill a bucket. That's when I heard it again, the steady crunch of someone walking in the field, not far, maybe 50 feet away. I froze. I didn't turn my head. I just stood there with my hands tight around the bucket handle. The steps stopped too. The air felt heavy, pressing in on me. Then I heard the faintest drag, like something brushing against the dry stalks that were left from last year's corn. My mouth went dry. I set the bucket down slowly and walked back inside without looking back. I barred the door with a heavy beam and sat up the rest of the night, every sound magnified until my ears ached. Days became worse than nights. The cabin felt smaller each time I returned to it, like the walls were closing in. I caught myself staring out the windows, scanning the horizon over and over. Once, in the daylight, I saw a figure at the far edge of the field. Too far to make out details, but tall, standing still, facing the cabin. I blinked, and it was gone, or maybe it had just crouched down. I told myself it was a scarecrow left in some forgotten corner, but I knew there had never been one out there. By the 10th night, I was exhausted. My body wanted sleep, but my mind refused. I lay on the cot with the axe across my chest, eyes on the faint glow of the lantern. Then, close to midnight, there was a sound that made my blood run cold. The door handle turned. Slow, deliberate. It rattled softly against the latch, then stopped. I didn't breathe. The cabin was silent for maybe 30 seconds. Then came the sound of something brushing against the wood outside, moving along the wall. My eyes followed it, tracing the path toward the window near my cot. I didn't look directly, couldn't, but from the corner of my vision, I saw the faint outline of a hand press against the glass. Long fingers, smudging the dirt-streaked pane. I gripped the axe tighter, every muscle locked. The hand stayed there for what felt like forever, then slid down slowly until it vanished. I didn't move until dawn. When the gray light filled the cabin, I finally stood and checked the window. There was a streak across the glass, not clear enough to be a handprint, but something had been there. I packed my things that morning. My nerves were shot, my head aching from days without rest. As I loaded the truck, I looked back at the fields one last time. The land stretched flat and endless, waving with grass. But at the far edge, right where the field met the tree line, I saw movement again. A figure too far to make out clearly, standing perfectly still, facing me. I didn't wave. I didn't wait. I started the engine, turned down the gravel road, and didn't look back again. By the time I reached town, I had convinced myself I wasn't going back. I left the keys with my uncle, told him the place needed too much work, and that I'd rather stay in the city. He didn't press me. Even now, years later, I can still hear that sound. The slow, heavy footsteps in the dirt, circling the cabin. And sometimes when I drive through empty farmland at night, I catch myself looking out at the fields, scanning for a figure that shouldn't be there. I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone was out there watching me walking the fields around that cabin night after night. And if I had stayed any longer, I don't think I'd be here to tell it. I remember the first time I saw that cabin, tucked deep in the forest of northern Minnesota, back in the fall of 1994. I was 26, still trying to prove myself as a serious hunter. I had borrowed the place from an older guy I worked with at the mill. He said it was nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a roof, and a wood stove, but it would keep me out of the cold and away from the mosquitoes. He failed to mention how isolated it was. The drive out took nearly 4 hours from Duluth. The last stretch wasn't even a proper road, just a narrow dirt trail that twisted through trees so close together I could hear branches scraping the sides of my truck. The forest swallowed sound. By the time I arrived, the late September sun was already dropping, throwing long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. It was a squat little thing, built of rough logs that had turned gray from decades of weather. The roof sagged in the middle. The front door had no lock, just a simple latch. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old smoke. A single cot sat against the back wall, a rusty stove in the corner, and a rickety table with 2 mismatched chairs. A cracked window looked out toward the tree line. I unloaded my gear and set up quickly. The air carried a sharp chill, the kind that reminds you winter isn't far. I gathered some dead branches and started a fire in the stove. The place warmed slowly, but the shadows clung stubbornly to the corners. The first night passed quietly. I sat on the cot, cleaning my rifle, listening to the fire pop. Outside, I could hear the occasional snap of branches, the shuffle of animals moving unseen through the woods. That kind of sound never bothered me before, but here, so far from anyone else, it carried a different weight. I told myself it was just deer or maybe raccoons. The next morning, I was up before dawn. A thick fog clung to the ground as I hiked into the forest. The trees were tall, thin pines, their tops swaying in the breeze. The silence felt heavy, as if even the birds were reluctant to break it. I found a spot near a ridge, sat down and waited. Hours passed with no sign of game. Around mid-morning, I decided to head back. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. In the soft dirt of the trail, I saw boot prints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and fresher than I expected. I knelt down and studied them. The tread was deep, the kind you'd get from a heavy work boot. They led in the same direction I was walking, toward the cabin. At first, I told myself maybe they were old, left by someone weeks ago. But the edges were crisp, not softened by rain or wind. Someone else had been out there. When I reached the cabin, the prints stopped near the door. My chest tightened. I stood there for a long minute, scanning the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, everything looked the same. My gear was untouched. The stove was cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone had been there. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart racing. I could hear movement in the trees, heavier than the night before. Something or someone was walking the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't light the lantern. I just sat in the dark, clutching the rifle, waiting. Hours dragged by. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I found more tracks circling the cabin. They weren't scattered like a hunter's would be. They were deliberate pacing, as if someone had walked around and around, studying the place. I searched for other signs, broken branches, discarded trash, but found nothing. Whoever it was, they knew how to move quietly. By the third day, I was too uneasy to hunt. I stayed close to the cabin, keeping the rifle within reach. Around midday, I noticed something strange hanging from a tree about 30 yards out. I walked over cautiously. It was a deer skull, stripped clean, tied to a branch with a length of rope. The rope was new, bright against the pale bone. My stomach turned. That wasn't something a random hunter would leave. It was placed there, for me to see. The rest of the day, I kept scanning the woods. I thought I caught glimpses of movement, a flash of dark clothing between the trees, a quick shift of shadow. But each time I raised the rifle, the forest stood still. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat at the table with the rifle across my lap, lantern burning low. Hours passed in silence. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the frost outside. They circled the cabin, pausing near the window, then moving to the door. The latch rattled softly, as if someone was testing it. My skin crawled. I held my breath, waiting for the door to swing open, but it didn't. After what felt like forever, the footsteps drifted back into the trees. When daylight came, I stepped outside. Fresh boot prints were everywhere, deep in the frost. My chest tightened when I saw what was carved into the dirt near the door. A crude arrow pointing straight at the cabin. That was it. I packed my gear in a rush. My hands shook so badly it took me 3 tries to get the rifle case closed. I loaded the truck and didn't look back. The drive out felt endless, the trees pressing close, as if they wanted to swallow the vehicle whole. When I finally reached the paved road, I pulled over and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, breathing hard. The forest behind me was silent, but I couldn't shake the thought that whoever had been out there was still watching. I never went back to that cabin. When the guy from the mill asked how the trip went, I just said the hunting was poor and left it at that. I didn't tell him about the tracks, the skull, or the footsteps in the night. Even now, more than 30 years later, I still think about it. The sound of boots crunching outside, the feeling of being studied from the dark. People like to say the woods are empty, that you're alone out there. But I know better. Someone had been watching me that week, moving around me, close enough to touch the door, close enough to leave signs just to see how I'd react. They didn't try to kill me. They didn't try to steal anything. They just wanted me to know they were there, and that's what unsettles me most. I still think about that night in the cabin, even though years have passed. It was in the fall of 1998 when I was 26. I had borrowed a small cabin in the mountains of northern Colorado from a coworker who used it for hunting season. I wasn't a hunter myself, but I wanted some quiet away from the city. The cabin was old but sturdy, tucked back at the end of a dirt track that looked more like a forgotten logging road than something anyone still used. The trees pressed close on both sides, tall pines mixed with aspen, their yellow leaves already starting to fall. The cabin sat in a clearing not much bigger than a backyard. It had one main room with a wood stove, a tiny kitchen area, and a small bedroom at the back. There was no running water, just a hand pump out front, and no electricity besides a car battery hooked up to a couple of dim lights. It was rough but livable, and I thought I'd be fine for a long weekend. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent them hiking around, taking in the silence, reading paperbacks I'd brought along. The nights were colder than I expected, and the stove burned through wood fast, so I spent time cutting more. By the second night, I was used to the sound of the forest outside, the creaks of the cabin, and the occasional scurry of mice in the walls. The third night was different. That day had been windy, and branches kept snapping off in the woods. The clouds never cleared, so the sky went dark earlier than usual. I lit a kerosene lamp and sat in the main room, playing solitaire with an old deck of cards. Around 8, I heard something outside, steps crunching in the leaves. At first I thought it was a deer since I'd seen a few around, but the rhythm was too heavy. It sounded more like boots on the ground, deliberate and slow. I froze in my chair. I didn't own a gun, only a hatchet I'd used for wood. My heart started pounding as I blew out the lamp, leaving the room in darkness except for the faint orange glow of the stove. The steps circled the cabin, stopping now and then starting again. They weren't rushed, just steady, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. After a while, I forced myself to move. I grabbed the hatchet and crept to the bedroom, where there was a small window facing the clearing. The glass was fogged from condensation, but I wiped it with my sleeve. The moon wasn't out, but enough light filtered through the clouds to see the clearing faintly. First, nothing. Then, near the tree line, I caught movement. A figure stood there, just far enough that I couldn't make out details. Tall, broad-shouldered, and completely still, as if they were waiting. My stomach dropped. I stayed at the window for what felt like forever, but they never came closer. Eventually, I backed away and sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the hatchet, listening. The steps came back later around midnight, this time closer, right up against the walls. I heard the crunch of boots on the porch. The doorknob rattled once, hard, then again. Whoever it was didn't try to force it, just tested it. Then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every creak made me jump. By dawn, I was exhausted, but I forced myself outside. The clearing looked normal, but when I checked the dirt near the porch, I found prints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Large, deep, the kind made by someone heavy. They circled the cabin and led back into the woods. I followed them a little way, but after 30 yards, they disappeared in the pine needles. I thought about leaving right then, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself maybe it was a hunter passing through, maybe drunk, maybe lost. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had watched me on purpose. The day passed in a haze. I tried reading again, but couldn't focus. I chopped more wood just to burn energy. Every sound in the trees made me glance up, certain I'd see someone watching. That night, I tried to stay awake, sitting near the stove with the hatchet close by. Around 2 in the morning, I must have drifted off because I woke to a noise that didn't belong. It wasn't footsteps this time, it was the window, the faint scrape of something against the glass in the bedroom. My chest went tight. I crept down the short hall, and when I got close, I could hear breathing. Not mine. Not inside, but outside, just beyond the window. Slow, steady breaths fogging the glass. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like stone. I gripped the hatchet until my knuckles ached. The breathing stopped, and then came a light tap on the window. Just once. I backed into the main room, heart hammering so loud I thought it would give me away. Minutes dragged. I couldn't hear anything else. I finally worked up the nerve to peek through the front curtain. Just a sliver. The clearing was empty, but when I looked down at the porch, I saw a shape. Something had been left there. At dawn, I opened the door. On the porch, right in the middle of the boards, was a dead rabbit. Its neck had been snapped, and its body was laid out neatly, like a gift. The tracks in the dirt showed the same boots from before. They came straight up, dropped the rabbit, then walked back to the trees. That was it for me. I packed my things in less than 10 minutes, tossed them in the back of my old Chevy, and drove down that dirt track faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I hit pavement miles away. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. I never went back to that cabin. I never even told my coworker what happened. He probably still uses it for hunting, maybe never had a problem. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was just some stranger messing with me, maybe worse. All I know is that someone spent 2 nights circling that cabin, leaving tracks, leaving a dead animal, and making sure I knew I wasn't alone. And the part that unsettles me the most isn't what they did. It's wondering what they might have done if I had stayed one more night. I was 38 when I drove out to the small cabin in northern Montana in the fall of 2012. It was a property my uncle had left behind after he passed. Nothing fancy, just a weathered little place surrounded by thick pine woods and a half-mile of gravel road that cut off from the highway. I had taken a week off work to get away, clear my head, and maybe fix the place up a bit. The cabin had always been in the family, but no one really stayed there for more than a weekend. It sat in a lonely patch of land, the nearest neighbor being a rancher at least 6 or 7 miles away. The air smelled sharp and clean that week, colder than it had been back home in Spokane, and the trees seemed to press closer around the cabin the longer I stayed. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I stacked firewood, patched a hole in the roof, and swept out the dust and cobwebs. The cabin was basic: 2 rooms, a wood stove, and a small porch with a swing that creaked if you even leaned on it. There was no running water, just a pump outside, and no electricity beyond a small generator I brought with me. The 3rd night, things started to feel off. I had gone for a walk in the late afternoon, following an old trail behind the cabin. The ground was littered with pine needles and the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods. About an hour in, I got the strange feeling I wasn't alone. Not the kind of maybe there's a bear around feeling, but something sharper. The woods had gone still. No birds, no wind, no crunch of animals moving through brush. When I stopped walking, I swore I heard a second pair of footsteps stop a beat after mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at the trees, trying to make sense of it. After a while, I turned back and walked to the cabin, faster than I normally would. That night, around midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel shifting outside. The cabin had a single window that faced the dirt road, and when I sat up in bed, I could see faint beams of light sweep across the trees. A car was out there, slow, like it was creeping past, but the road didn't lead anywhere but to my cabin. The lights cut off and the sound of the engine went dead. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the window until my eyes burned. After a while, I heard crunching footsteps on the gravel again, closer this time, stopping just outside. Then nothing. No knock, no voice, just silence. I didn't sleep again until morning. The next day, I walked out to the road to check for tracks. There were fresh tire marks pressed into the dirt, sharp and clear, leading up to the cabin and then turning back the way they came. I tried to shrug it off as someone getting lost, but deep down I knew better. Nobody accidentally drove down that road, especially not at midnight. That evening, I made sure to double-check the old lock on the front door. It was a thin piece of metal that didn't inspire much confidence, but it was all I had. I kept the lantern low and tried to read, anything to keep my mind busy. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something scrape across the side of the cabin. Not an animal scratching, this was slow, dragging like metal against wood. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my neck. I grabbed the hunting rifle my uncle had left behind and sat in the dark, listening. The scraping went from one wall to the other, deliberate, circling. Then it stopped. I sat there gripping that rifle until the sun came up. By the 5th day, I was worn down from not sleeping. Every little sound outside made me tense up. A branch cracking, a gust of wind hitting the shutters. I jumped at all of it. I considered leaving early, but something in me wanted to prove I wasn't scared off. That afternoon, I went into town for supplies. When I got back, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the porch, pressed into the dust, were footprints. Not boots like mine, but flat-soled shoes. The tracks led right up to the door, then around to the side window. I hadn't seen them that morning, which meant they were new. That night, the noises came back. At first, it was the crunch of footsteps circling. Then, faint tapping on the window, slow and spaced apart. I forced myself not to move, not even to breathe loud. After a while, I heard the porch swing creak, the weight of someone sitting down. It groaned back and forth in a steady rhythm. I stayed in bed with the rifle across my chest, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in me burning. Around 4 in the morning, it finally stopped. When daylight came, I walked outside to see if I had imagined it. The swing was still moving slightly, though there was no wind. On the railing, there was a fresh cigarette but crushed into the wood. Nobody in my family smoked. My hands shook as I picked it up and tossed it into the dirt. That was enough. I packed my things and loaded the truck. The entire time, I felt eyes on me from the tree line, but I never saw anyone. As I drove back down that gravel road, I checked the mirror every few seconds, half expecting a car to appear behind me. Nothing ever did. When I got back home, I told myself I'd never go back there. A month later, I got a call from the county sheriff. He said a hiker had been found in the woods a mile from the cabin, badly beaten, barely alive. The man had been living rough out there for weeks, hiding, watching people's cabins, looking for ones he could break into. The sheriff asked if I'd seen or heard anything unusual. I just said no. I thought about the scraping on the walls, the footprints by the porch, the swing moving in the night. I thought about lying in that bed with the rifle, knowing someone was only a few feet away on the other side of the wall, sitting there in the dark, watching, waiting. That cabin still sits out there in the trees. I never went back. I was 36 when I decided to spend a week alone in an old hunting cabin I'd bought cheap a few years earlier. It was tucked deep into the woods of northern Idaho, far enough from the nearest town that you could drive an hour without seeing another car. The land around it was mostly forest, with a few dirt roads that twisted through thick pines and broken hills. The cabin itself sat back off a rutted trail that you'd miss if you weren't looking closely. The cabin had been built in the late 70s. Nothing fancy, just wood walls, a metal roof that rattled when wind pushed across the ridge, and a single room with a small loft above. I'd fixed up the basics, sealed the leaks, patched the floor, ran a line to a small generator, but otherwise I'd kept it simple. It was the kind of place where you could disappear and nobody would even notice. That was what I liked about it. I went up in mid-October. The weather was cold but not frozen yet. The mornings had a wet chill, and mist usually hung between the trees until noon. I packed enough supplies to last the week. Canned food, some hunting gear, a few gallons of water, and my rifle. I didn't really plan to hunt, but I always brought the gun. Out there, you didn't take chances. The first 2 days were quiet. I spent most of my time cutting wood and walking the property lines. The silence was heavy in the woods. You could hear every crunch of your boots, every shift of branches, and every bird call carried far. At night, the woods pressed in even more. When I killed the lantern, the dark was so thick you could feel it. I'd sit by the small fire I kept in the stove and listen. Sometimes a branch would snap outside. Sometimes I'd hear something moving through leaves, but I told myself it was always deer. By the third night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't noise. I'd grown used to the creaks and snaps outside. It was more like the stillness itself was different. I woke around 2 in the morning and sat up in the loft. The fire in the stove had gone down, just faint orange glowing through the cracks. The cabin was freezing. I pulled on my jacket and listened. At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen, but then I realized I hadn't actually heard anything. It was dead silent, too silent. Not even the owls that usually called out at night. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I went further out into the woods, walking along a ridge line that gave me a view down into a narrow valley. I noticed boot tracks in the dirt near the ridge. Not mine, I hadn't been that way yet. The tread looked fresh, maybe a day or 2 old. They weren't from a hunter's heavy boots either. They looked smaller, flatter, more like work boots. I crouched down and followed them a little ways, but they cut off into brush and disappeared. I didn't see anyone all day. By dusk, though, I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. Nobody I knew ever came out here. The land around mine was government forest, but it wasn't a popular hiking spot. You'd have to go out of your way to end up here. That night, I kept the lantern on longer than usual. The glow reached the corners of the cabin, but every shadow looked heavier than it should have. I lay in the loft, wide awake, listening to the wind scratch the roof and branches knock against the siding. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, moving across the dirt near the porch. My chest tightened. I froze, not even breathing, straining to hear. The steps stopped. I waited, every muscle tight. Then I heard the faint groan of the porch wood. Someone had stepped up onto it. The boards creaked again, closer this time, like they were moving toward the door. I reached for my rifle, careful not to make noise. I kept it pointed at the loft opening, just listening. The footsteps paused right outside the door. The latch rattled. Not hard, just a soft test, like someone touching it, seeing if it was locked. My throat went dry. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like forever, the latch stopped. The porch creaked once more, then nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the rifle. When the first light came through the trees, I climbed down and checked outside. The ground was damp from dew, and I could see fresh boot prints in the dirt leading up to the porch. They circled the cabin once, then headed back toward the trail. Same tread as before, flat work boots. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the tension. I didn't see anyone in the woods, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every branch snap set me on edge. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to feel chased out. This was my place. I told myself it was probably just some drifter passing through, curious about the cabin. That night, I built the fire higher than usual. I ate quickly, barely tasting the food, and kept my rifle across my lap. Hours dragged. At some point, exhaustion caught me and I dozed off in the chair by the stove. I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the rifle and stayed low, listening. The footsteps were back, circling the cabin again, slower this time. I could hear them crunch through leaves, pause, then move again. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. I thought about shouting, but something told me not to. If I let them know I was awake, it could make things worse. Instead, I sat there, staring at the door, waiting. The footsteps came closer, then the sound of the porch boards again. This time, they didn't go to the door. They went to the window. The cabin had one small window over the sink. I hadn't covered it. The sound of fingers tapping lightly on the glass made my whole body lock. Just slow, deliberate taps, then silence. I stayed frozen until the first light came again. When I finally worked up the courage to check, there were smudges on the glass like fingerprints. Outside, more boot prints circled the cabin. They led off into the woods, vanishing in the undergrowth. I didn't wait around. I packed my gear fast, loaded it into the truck, and drove down the rutted trail as fast as I could manage without wrecking the suspension. Every mile I expected to see someone step out into the road. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never saw who it was. Maybe it was some hermit living rough in the woods, maybe just a stranger passing through. But the way they moved around that cabin, silent, patient, testing the door, tapping the glass, it wasn't random. Felt like they were waiting, watching to see what I would do. I sold the cabin a few months later. Took a loss on it, but I didn't care. I never went back. The woods up there are quiet, but quiet doesn't mean safe. Sometimes the silence is just someone waiting for you to let your guard down.